Andrew was driving home from yet another triumphant day. At 46, life had finally, exactly just the way he'd always dreamed. The business he had spent years developing was prospering, with profits soaring. His wife of more than 15 years, Melissa, was expecting their second child. Julia, their eldest daughter, will be attending a renowned college this year. Pleased to himself, Andrew let the automobile lie down. With the hum of the motor combining with the comfortable beat of his thoughts for the first time in years, he felt fully at peace. He'd worked hard to provide for his family, and now he could enjoy the results of his labor. But life doesn't give warnings before striking him. Nothing happened when he lightly touched the brakes to ease into a corner. A rush of panic surged over him as he pressed the brake pedal. Seemed loose and worthless as the car gained speed on a mild downhill section. Andrew gripped the steering wheel tightly and searched the road ahead. The cars were moving slowly, and the following curve, approaching too swiftly for comfort. His pulse thundered as his mind raced. Could this be happening? He switched into a lower gear, attempting to slow the speed. He manually slowed the car, but not enough, and then he noticed the gravel. He drove towards it, his hands trembling as he battled to control the truck. Fortunately, the iron fence on the edge of the road eased the braking. The automobile was damaged, but Andrew was unscathed. His heart hammered in his chest. Andrew remained still for a moment, his hands still grasping the wheel. His life had just flashed before his eyes. Melissa. For a brief moment, he felt he would never see Julia, their unborn child. Andrew wasted little time in getting the car to a repair shop where the mechanic. Andrew shuffled uncomfortably while a burly man with oily hands surveyed the automobile. The brake lines had been tampered with, the mechanic eventually muttered grimly. Andrew questioned angrily, pausing in his tracks, and the mechanic answered, wiping his hands on a rag. This ain't wear and tear. Someone messed with it, Andrew. Stomach turned tampered with. Who would do something like that? He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the mechanic was wrong, or maybe there was another explanation he chose not to concentrate on. That evening, Andrew returned home to their huge suburban house. Melissa greeted him at the door, her cheeks flushed and her grin genuine, as always. She had that light about her, but tonight something looked odd. He stepped inside. Taking off his jacket, Melissa's sister Victoria was sat on the couch in the living room, her eyes fastened to her. When she looked up at Andrew, she gave him a tight, fake smile. Melissa replied, wiping a strand of hair from her face. You're home late. Everything's okay. Automobile trouble, Andrew responded casually, opting to keep the information to himself. It's in the shop now. Melissa nodded, but her smile slipped. Head slightly beside Victoria. Stiffened, she didn't glance up from her phone, but her fingers stopped moving for a split second, and Andrew caught it. He couldn't tell if the flicker was from remorse, worry, or something else. His eyes darted between the two women, as his thoughts repeated the mechanic's comments to Victoria. Broke the silence with her characteristic cynicism. Perhaps you should acquire a new car, Andrew, or learn how to take care of the. Andrew smirked, refusing to take Victoria's bait. Never liked him. Many years ago they had a fight, but more on that later. As Andrew lay in bed with Melissa that night, he couldn't stop wondering what Melissa had. Seemed distracted, and Victoria's customary animosity was sharper than ever. That shared glance between them when he mentioned the car gnawed at him. Andrew told himself he was overthinking. Melissa was carrying their child after all, and perhaps she was just exhausted. Victoria felt well, yet an uneasy feeling prickled at her. Something didn't feel right at the borders of his thoughts, and Andrew awoke before dawn. With the events of the previous day still plaguing him, he softly got out of bed so as not to disturb Melissa, put on a jumper, and hurried to the garage. He needed answers, or at least some reassurance. Standing at Melissa's SUV, Andrew paused the soft yellow. The light from the garage created long shadows across the car's sleek body. His heart beat as he imagined the prospect. What if there's anything wrong with this automobile as well? He stepped into the driver's seat and quietly closed the door behind him. He merely sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The air was still heavy with dread from the recollections. Andrew's worry was heightened by the brake failure. His hands trembled slightly as he brushed his fingertips over the dashboard, hoping to find the bravery to start the engine. After 3 to 10 minutes, he sighed and leaned back with his hand instead. He instinctively headed towards the glove compartment, unsure of what he anticipated to discover, perhaps the owners. He opened it expecting to see an old parking ticket or a forgotten pair of sunglasses, but what he discovered was far from. A hefty envelope nestled among the normal mess, and Andrew took it up. Slipped out its contents, his blood ran cold. The paperwork were for a comprehensive. Family insurance policies were beautiful, freshly produced, and the majority. Importantly, they were new. The policy was issued only 2 weeks ago. In it, Melissa had never revealed that they had always specifically covered the family in the event of Andrew's death. Been open about their finances and aspirations. Why had she done this in? Secret his mind turned as he glanced at the documents, his heart thudding like a drum. Andrew's hands went on autopilot as he took a picture of the documents using his phone and carefully returned them to. In the glove box, he sat shocked, trying to peek. Eat together. Possibilities, first the brake failure, and now this hidden insurance policy was too. Please find out what occurs next before dismissing anything as a coincidence. Subscribe to the channel. He hopped out of the car just as the garage door creaked open. Andrew froze, turning to see Melissa standing there with her robe carefully wrapped around her and her hair slightly. Andrew disheveled. She replied in a sleepy tone, "What are you?" Andrew forced a smile in the garage, hoping she wouldn't detect the stiffness in his shoulders. "And I was thinking about taking your automobile today," he added with a joking tone, "but I thought, what if you need it? It's best if I just phone a taxi." Melissa's gaze furrowed. Her look was temporarily inscrutable. "You're sure?" she asked her. Andrew responded, his voice tinged with what he perceived to be apprehension. Keeping his tone casual, "You never know when you'll need to go an errand, and I don't want to leave you stranded, Melissa." She paused, then nodded, though her stare lingered on him for a moment too long. Andrew moved by her with a friendly smile. "Let me know if you need anything." Pretending everything was fine, but within his head was a maelstrom of uncertainties. Melissa's reaction was not overt, but something about her demeanor concerned him during the taxi journey to the workplace. It was uneventful, but Andrew felt like the walls were closing in on him by the time he reached his private office. His hands shaking, he locked the door behind him, slumped into his chair, and buried his face in his hands. Is this really happening? He thought the photo of the insurance policy shining from his phone screen. The idea of heading to the police came to mind, but he ignored it because he couldn't make unfounded claims. Not yet. If he was mistaken, the damage to his family would be irreversible. He began studying private detectives. They had to be discreet and professional. After an hour of Googling and reading reviews, he discovered John T. Taylor, a seasoned detective with a reputation for revealing the. 2 hours later, Andrew sat across from John. In a drab office on the outskirts of the city, the man before him was lean. Mr. Marshall John, with piercing eyes and a radiance of competence, said, leaning back in his chair, "What can I do for you?" Andrew hesitated, looked around, as if the walls themselves may betray him. He took a deep breath and put everything out the brake. "Melissa's weird behavior is something I don't want to jump to conclusions," Andrew remarked, his voice shaking slightly. "But something doesn't feel right. I need to know what's going on." John leaned back, rubbing his hands together, then shook his head. Sharp eyes fixated on Andrew. "Well, Andrew, it appears you've gotten yourself into a difficult circumstance. Tell me a little about your family." Andrew hesitated before starting to say. Laying it all out, he told Jan about Melissa and how they'd been dating for. He spoke about how they'd established a life together for 15 years and how much he adored her. On Julia, their intelligent daughter, moving off to college soon, he highlighted the firm and his recent triumphs. When John concluded his studies, he brought up Melissa's sister Victoria, the relationship he imagined his family shared. He paused for a bit before asking, "Well, based on your story, do you have an ideal life? At least you did till yesterday. Are you sure there aren't any issues or secrets you've disregarded my experience? Tells me that there's something disturbing here." This kind of set up John. His gaze darkened as he drifted off, suggesting a contract murdering Andrew. John cringed at the words, his stomach twisting, and held up his hand too early. "To say for sure, but you need to think Andrew about whatever you might have." Andrew squirmed uncomfortably as he searched his recollection. Victoria instantly recalled an old recollection that he hadn't thought about in years. He mumbled, "Maybe go on." John pushed, leaning forward. 15 years ago I started. The transaction with Victoria's husband Carl Andrew began with a quiet voice at first. Everything was wonderful. He had ideas, and we collaborated well, but after a year, I discovered he was conducting fraud, embezzling money behind my back. It could have damaged everything I exposed him to. Carl was sentenced to prison, and 6 months later he died of a heart attack. I frowned, but didn't interrupt after that because things were difficult with Victoria. Sorry, I assisted her financially and made sure she was okay, but she always blamed me for Carl's death, saying that the stress of prison killed him over time, but she seemed to forgive me. Moved in with us, sometimes helping Melissa while I was busy with work. Andrew hesitated, shaking his head. But I guess the connection has always been complex. John's expression stiffened. If we're looking for intentions, this seems too tangled to be a coincidence. Well, here's one, a huge one. Andrew's stomach twisted as John proceeded. The worst option is that your wife is in cahoots with Victoria, but then John tapped his pen on the table. If things are going so well between you and Melissa, why would she do this? Andrew opened his mouth, but no. When the words came, he had no response. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Andrew, let me ask you a question. Is it possible Melissa has a lover?" Andrew recoiled, shakes his head furiously. No way. She's kind, honest. Melissa isn't like that. Yet as he said the words, a shard of doubt crept in. Could he truly be so sure anymore? His voice wavered. "We need to rule out the possibility that." John leaned back, steepling his fingers. "To confirm that, here's what I recommend. First, perform a DNA test with your daughter Julia." Andrew's heart fell as he realized who Julia was. "My daughter, I know she is, or maybe she isn't," John responded evenly. "It's something we need to clarify. Second, I recommend we wiretap your house discreetly. No one will know Andrew." He nodded hesitantly, as if his world was slipping through his fingers. John moved forward, his voice low. "And one more thing, Andrew, it's preferable if you leave town and go on a business trip, or find a cause to stay away for a time. I've encountered incidents like this before, and let me tell you, they can get risky fast. I have had a case in which a husband was poisoned for months. His wife mixed it to his food and drinks. It was nearly perfect until I caught her. But the guy almost died and was left blind, and the room seemed to get colder." Andrew fidgeted in his chair, his pulse hammering. Cold sweat speckled his forehead. John's gaze latched into his. "Your travels are just beginning, Andrew." Andrew awakened the next morning with a sense of purpose, ready for anything. Unpleasant talk with John. He realized he needed to play his cards carefully because he was walking a tight RPP, and any misstep can have significant implications. At breakfast, he decided to test the waters. "How about a family day out?" Andrew remarked, attempting to seem casual as he spread jam on his toast. "A water park, perhaps?" "Dinner at a wonderful restaurant." Melissa looked up, shocked. "A water park? You'd never said that before." "Exactly," Andrew responded with a grin. "It's long We've been so busy that it'll be excellent for all of us to have Julia focused in her. Victoria sat in the water park, which sounded cool. The corner of the table lifted an eyebrow, and Andrew noticed her skeptical attitude, but she didn't say anything. When the family left for their outing, the house stood empty, which was ideal. Opportunity John and his team arrived in a nondescript van and went to work quickly, installing wiretaps and subtle hidden cameras in crucial sections of the house, including the kitchen, living room, and even the. They worked efficiently in the main bedroom and left no indication of their presence. Andrew made care to act like his typical self at the water park. He smiled, joked, and Melissa seemed to relax throughout the day, even joining Julia on a couple water slides. Despite her diminishing suspicions, Victoria remained restrained while watching Andrew. During supper at a quiet Italian restaurant, Andrew brought up the topic of his work trip. I wanted to let you know, he began chopping into his steak. I've got a major assignment coming up at work. It's crucial, and I'll need to be out of town for a couple of weeks. Alyssa's smile faded. You're leaving again? She asked, her tone tinged with displeasure. Andrew, you're always busy with work. I'm pregnant and Julia is leaving to college soon. Do you think we need you here? Andrew was ready to speak when Victoria interrupted, her voice calm yet. Melissa told out that sometimes you have to prioritize what is necessary. Andrew is. Melissa gave Victoria a harsh glare, but she quickly calmed herself with a fake smee. Lowen said, You're right. Andrew overreacted and attentively studied the exchange, which was subtle, yet Melissa seemed to take Victoria's words as a warning for now, and she backed off back home. That night, Andrew's nerves were on edge, and he couldn't escape the sensation that something evil was going on around him. When Melissa offered him tea, he respectfully declined, choosing instead to brew his own chamomile blend. Are you all right? Melissa inquired, examining him intently. As he stirred the tea, Andrew smiled cheerfully. I'm all right, just trying to make. You shouldn't have to worry about anything right now. Melissa tilted her head and studied him for a while, then nodded and went away. A few days later, Andrew packed his small. After packing his suitcase and saying his goodbyes, he hugged Julia a little longer than normal, his heart heavy from thinking about the DNA. Andrew then kissed Melissa on the cheek and walked away without looking back. Checked into a basic hotel several towns away. The room was small but practical and the perfect spot to lie low. While he waited for updates from John and the DNA lab, waiting wasn't enough. Following John's guidance, Andrew started reviewing his personal finances. Appeared regular at first, but then he noticed Melissa's account saw a succession of withdrawals, each for a large amount, and the timing aligned with the date on the insurance coverage. All right, Andrew mumbled to himself. Perhaps she just. I required the money for the policy, but the maths didn't add to the total amount. Melissa's withdrawal greatly exceeded the amount of the insurance. Andrew felt the Titan had a knot in his gut, and Andrew was wondering where the rest of the money was going. With no answer, he slumped back in his chair and glanced at the ceiling of his hotel. To heck with it, he mumbled. I'll wait for John's report and the DNA. One step at a time, he looked at his phone, almost anticipating a call or text. Instead, the silence became oppressive and heavy. Then a call came. Late in the afternoon, Andrew sat on the side of his hotel bed, clutching tightly his phone, and the DNA lab's number flashed on the screen. He paused for a time before addressing Mr. Marshall. The voice on the other end said, We have completed the testing, and the results are conclusive for the DNA samples you submitted. Julia is not your biological daughter. And the words strike Andrew. Like a goods train, he felt as if the ground beneath him had evaporated. His eyesight clouded and his chest squeezed. As he strained to breathe, his world, the life he had built, and the family he thought was collapsed in an instant. His hands shook as he dialed John's number. The phone hardly rung before the detective answered, and Andrew. John shouted. Tone sharp, what's wrong? Sheck, not mine, Andrew choked out Julia. She's not mine. Daughter John let out a low sigh, full of sorrow and frustration. Was terrified of it. He mumbled, Lee. Stan, Andrew, I know this is difficult, but you need to stay focused. They're starting to break, and that's when individuals make mistakes. I've been monitoring everything. The ladies Melissa and Victoria are anxious, but they are being really careful. Do you have anything concrete? Andrew inquired, desperation oozing into his voice. I do, John said, tone deliberate, but I need more time to piece everything together. There is a larger picture forming, Andrew, but we're not there yet. In the meanwhile, you need to act quickly. What do you mean, Andrew? Voice was raspy. First, you need to get a lawyer, Jonathan added firmly, a good one. You also need financial advisors to hide your assets and file for divorce before Melissa can. If you don't, they may get. Why are you in such a hurry? Andrew inquired, still reeling. I delayed before responding for 2 reasons. If you file first, they would panic, and I will have a better chance of gathering information. They'll make mistakes under pressure. And 2, if Melissa files first, she could freeze your accounts or try to claim a portion of your assets. Don't give them that chance, even if you are overwhelmed. Andrew recognized the wisdom in John's statements. I'll complete it over the next 10 days, heavy with resolution. Andrew worked relentlessly, too. To secure his position, he recruited a top-tier divorce lawyer and a team of asset-specific financial consultants. They devised a plan to protect Andrew's fortune as the first stage. Andrew approached his most trustworthy partners, individuals who had backed him, about selling his share in the business. Throughout his career, he sold his ownership surreptitiously, ensuring that the cash were transferred into secure banks. Melissa and Victoria couldn't touch next under the supervision of his consultants. Andrew transferred the funds to a succession of shielded trusts and offshore accounts. It was a maze of financial precautions meant to make it almost hard for anyone to claim his assets. The divorce papers were drafted up, signed, and ready for service at a moment's notice. The final step was the most hardest, blocking all accounts. With the joint account he shared with Melissa, it felt cold calculating. When the last lock was in place, Andrew sat back in his chair. Tired but determined, he had done everything he could to protect himself. The following morning, Andrew glanced at his phone, considering whether to call Melissa, whom he hadn't spoken to directly. Since leaving for his business trip, he knew she'd notice the blocked account shortly, and he wondered how would react. The phone chimed, jolting Andrew from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Melissa. Andrew hesitated, but eventually said, "Hello, Andrew." Melissa began, her tone cautiously calm. "How are you? Is everything well at work?" "Everything is fine," Andrew said, maintaining his voice. "Even that is nice," Melissa continued, fast before her tone shifted, tinted with apprehension. "There's a payment. Julia's college is currently due. Make a down payment. And by the way, I checked. The bank account is frozen. What's going on? Did you block it? Or is there?" Andrew's heart plummeted, but he didn't show it. He took a big breath. He steadied himself before responding to Melissa, saying his voice was husky. "Not my daughter, so pay for it yourself. Also, a courier will be there today to bring the divorce papers." There was a sudden intake of breath on the other end. "What are you talking about, Andrew? You're not making any sense. Are you okay?" Andrew's grasp on the phone tightened. "Melissa, I'm okay, and I apologize. But we'll converse in court. We'll have much to say to each other." He abruptly interrupted the connection before her voice. As the silence returned to the room, Andrew's composure crumbled, and he buried his forehead in his hands and let the tears pour from his family, everything he had spent. After 15 years, the building was crumbling apart, and the worst thing was that he still did not have what additional truths were buried in Melissa and Victoria's carefully built lives. The phone buzzed again, and Andrew didn't look since he couldn't stand to face Melissa's fury, or her pleas. But when the third call came, his resolve slipped. It wasn't Melissa. It was Julia. Andrew wiped his face and replied, "Hello, Dad, Julia. What's going on? Mom is panicking out, and I don't understand anything she says about the accounts. Blocked, and I need money for the deposit. What is happening?" Andrew's throat clenched. But he forced himself to say, gently, "Julia, something happened at your institution. Plans might need to wait for a short while," as Julia said in her voice. Rising, "Dad, I can't wait. This is my future. What's going on? Please tell." Andrew pinched the bridge of his nose, gathering all the strength he had. "Julia, calm down your mother, and I need to sort out some things. I swear if you stay cool and behave, everything will work out. We'll discuss later, but Julia." Julia, Andrew softly but forcefully interrupted her when her voice began to break. There was a delay before Julia responded in a quiet voice. "Okay, Dad." The call ended, and Andrew laid the phone down and stared at the ceiling, shame and anguish churning inside him. Leaving Julia completely out of his life was not an option. He had reared her, loved her, and been her father. Whatever happened to Melissa and Victoria, Julia remained his daughter in his heart. But how much more could he suffer until this nightmare ended? Andrew scarcely slept that night. As he poured glass after glass of whiskey, the sting of betrayal refused to go away. Cried openly, primal guttural tears he hadn't allowed himself since infancy, and each drink softened the edges of his grief. But nothing could drown the agony of his broken family by dawn. The bottle was gone, leaving Andrew hollow and drained, staring blankly at the ceiling. His phone buzzed, jolting him back to reality. John Andrew J.N. stated briskly, "We've hit a turning point." The divorce news rattled them. "It's working. We need to meet today. Bring your lawyer." Andrew sighed, his head aching, and he pushed himself to acquiesce when John came at the agreed-upon office. His lawyer was already there, scrutinizing paperwork with a sad frown. He appeared a moment later, a huge bag in hand, his face set with the severity of a man about to detonate. "Bomb all right," John remarked as he placed the suitcase on the table. "This is what I've..." He opened it and started laying out evidence, pictures, and video clips. Transcripts of recorded conversations. Andrew and his lawyer leaned forward, astonished by the photographs and audio presented a horrible story about Melissa and Victoria. Whispering, conspiratorially making phone calls. There were meetings with a man whom John identified as Melissa's lover, Harry. Andrew's breath caught when he viewed images of Harry and Melissa's interactions were way too intimate to be platonic. John's voice was steady as he explained, but Andrew's heart beat in his ears, drowning out the majority of the facts. Lawyer mumbled under his breath, shaking his head in disgust. "Here's the clincher," John continued, pulling out an audio. Folly played a recording. The term sent a shudder down Andrew's spine, his vision. His chest clenched, and his lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder to stabilize him. "Andrew," John whispered quickly, "are you okay?" Andrew attempted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His head whirled, and a crushing agony clutched his chest. "Call a doctor," his lawyer yelled. The doctor arrived soon and checked Andrew, who was pale and sweating profusely. Following a brief conversation, the doctor gave him an injection to stabilize him since his heart was under too much strain. He warned about stress like this can be harmful. You need a comprehensive cardiac evaluation as soon as feasible. Nodded weakly, his body quivering, and he slumped back in his chair, his face ashen. Andrew Jen stated after a time, his tone softened, "I know this is overwhelming, but the proof is damning, and we may take this to court not only for the divorce but also for a criminal prosecution. Are you ready?" Andrew did not reply. Instead, he only nodded, his eyes black with purpose. 5 days later, the courtroom was packed. Andrew sat by his lawyer, his demeanor calm but hollow. Melissa sat across the room with Victoria and her team of lawyers, looking assured and resting her hand. Melissa's lawyers began the hearing by protecting her pregnant tummy in a subtle but deliberate move. In making their case, they portrayed Andrew as a methodical man who coldly plotted the divorce and asset freezing. They alleged his acts were deliberate, accusing him of being unfairly faithful to himself, which they disputed. The DNA result was inconclusive, therefore they ordered a new independent study. His strategy was clear: stretch the proceedings out, muddy the waters, and buy time. Andrew's lawyer battled back, deconstructing their arguments point by point, but the trial was grueling, with each exchange becoming a pull of war. The weight of the pregnancy was a strong weapon in Melissa's arsenal, and the opposing counsel used it masterfully. At a crucial time, Andrew met his lawyer's gaze and offered a small deliberate nod. The signal was plain. Andrew's counsel stood with his speech firm and methodical. "Your Honor, I want to introduce additional evidence relevant to this case." He gave the court a big folder. "I must warn you that," the lawyer remarked in a serious tone, "that this matter may no longer be limited to family law. It appears there are grounds for criminal investigation." The courtroom grew hushed. All eyes concentrated on the judge as he received the folder. His face wrinkled as he went through the first few pages. Then his countenance worsened. "What, take a 30-minute break," the judge stated, his voice heavy with authority. "I need time to study this material." In his chambers, the judge and two legal advisors sat, heated quiet, going through the damaging facts included in the folder. The deeper they explored, the darker the first segment featured photographic proof of Harry late at night. While hovering near Andrew's car, he tampered with precision and deliberateness. With the braking system, one photograph clearly showed Harry clutching a small wrench, and something else, his stance revealing. The deliberate style of his work made it clear that this was not a spontaneous crime. It was captured by a street security camera. The transcripts of recorded talks between Melissa and Victoria, taken after the unsuccessful attempt to destroy Andrew's car, their remarks indicated the strain of their plot, Melissa's rising worry. "This should have worked," Melissa murmured, contradicting Victoria's steely resolve, voice shaking. "Maybe we started this game in vain. What if we should have? It would have been simpler to just get a divorce." "Are you serious right now?" Victoria yelled. "If you just divorce him, Andrew will look into everything, find out about Harry, and then where will you be? No alimony, no assets. He'll bury you in court, Melissa." Melissa's response was tinged with apprehension. "But what if Harry gets?" Victoria responded to Harry's concern that this could ruin everything, tone cold and calculating. "He knows what's at stake, and don't forget that if Andrew dies, we get another generous. Paying out his legacy assets and insurance will give us a happy and wealthy life. Remember what Andrew did to my husband Carl. If he does not get out of the way, he will leave us bankrupt, and revenge if Andrew is out of the way. We've set you, me, and Harry secure for life." There was a long silence on the. Melissa's weak breathing interrupted the tape, but she eventually spoke. "Okay, you're right, but Victoria, I'm worried because this is risky." Victoria's chuckle was sharp and humorless. "And you'll be thanking me when this is over, Melissa. Trust me." The text included videos of Melissa and Harry. In one film, Harry softly stroked Melissa's belly, softened when he murmured to her that Harry was a minimum income person, has another reason to safeguard his future at Andrew's expense. The courtroom was tense as the judge returned from break. His look was grim, and his lips squeezed into a thin line. He shuffled the documents on his bench and looked up at the courtroom. "I had examined the information given by the petitioner counsel," began, his voice reverberating in the silent chamber. "The data is highly unsettling. It looks that we are dealing with not simply a bitter divorce, but also allegations of deliberate criminal action, including suspected conspiracy to commit murder Gasps echoed across the room. Melissa's face turned pale, her hands quivering. Victoria sat alongside her, widened her eyes but maintained her composure. The judge continued, considering the seriousness. Because of these charges and the overwhelming nature of the evidence, I am obligated to take urgent action. This court will notify police enforcement to fully investigate the matter until such an inquiry is completed, suspending all conversations pertaining to asset division and custody arrangements. The judge's comments settled. The gavel fell with a decisive thud, sweeping across the room like a storm cloud. This hearing is adjourned until further notice. Court personnel should stay in the building to assist the police. The courtroom admission sent shock waves across everyone concerned, and the police promptly initiated an inquiry. Melissa, Victoria, and Harry were arrested within days, and the fallout was swift and vicious. The evidence. John left no space for dispute about the break-in, the secret insurance policy, and the conversations explaining. Their aim was to eliminate Andrew from Melissa, Victoria, and Harry. Finally, they were charged with conspiracy and attempted murder. Andrew, though vindicated, felt no. Instead of being satisfied, he was left with the bitter ashes of what was once his family. The nightmare had revealed realities he never anticipated and damaged bonds he. Melissa sat across from Andrew in the antiseptic visitors' room, thinking they were unbreakable. The county jail, she appeared weary, her once vivid spark now muted by exhaustion. Regret, Andrew. She began, her voice shaking, and I don't even know where to. Andrew's expression remained chilly, his arms crossed, then don't just say. Melissa wiped her eyes as tears fell. I'm sorry. I never meant it to end this way. I've always loved Harry. Was my first love and my everything, but fate separated us. And then you came along. You were a nice man, Andrew, and a terrific provider. You were kind and stable, but you were never. Harry was my hero. Andrew clenched his jaw and his eye. As hard, and I realized what a placeholder, a bank account, the man you could tolerate while planning to kill me. Melissa shook her head, breaking down and sobbing. It wasn't supposed to go that far. I made terrible mistakes. Blunders I let Victoria convince me, and I was terrified that you'd take. Andrew did not react, keeping his stare fixated on her. Melissa sniffled, struggling. To restore composure, please, Andrew. She whispered, no matter what happens, promise. I'll take care of Julia. She's innocent in all of this. Andrew's voice sounded chilly and distant. Because she's my kid in every way that matters. But you, Melissa, you're nothing to me now, you destroyed. Melissa lowered her head defeatedly. I understand, she murmured. I'm sorry. Victoria sat in her cage with her chin held high, exuding none of. Melissa had showed remorse when Andrew came, and she met his eyes with pure, undiluted loathing. I suppose you're here to gloat. Victoria sneered. No, Andrew responded flatly. I want to understand why Victoria does this. Victoria laughed. I understand you think you're the victim here. You ruined my life, Andrew. You sent Carl to prison, and he died because of you. He was a decent man until you destroyed him. Andrew shook his head. Carl steadily became a fraud, Victoria. He embezzled money from the firm. He ruined himself with lies. She spat at you. Could have saved him, but you didn't because you were more concerned with your treasured firm. Treasured reputation, Andrew sighed, his tiredness clear. I understand your frustration, but you've distorted everything to fit your anger. Carl made his choices, and he betrayed. I had nothing to do with his death, and he had betrayed you as well. Victoria's look did not soften. You're a monster, Andrew, and I wanted to make you pay, but even now you're walking away with everything while we perish in here. Andrew stood, his face devoid of emotion. I won't pity you. Either you made your decisions as Carl did when Andrew sat down with Julia, braced himself for the worst. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face etched with shock and wrath. How could you? Dad, she demanded, her voice shaking. Mom is in prison. Aunt Victoria is in. Everything is wrecked in prison, Julia Andrew remarked softly. You know why they tried? Murder me. I didn't want any of this to happen. But I couldn't deny the fact that they're my family, she shouted. Breaking and you wrecked us. Andrick's heart ached at her words. Julia, I know. This is painful, but they made their own decisions. I had to protect myself and your. Julia yelled as tears streamed over her cheeks. You could have fixed this. You could have done something. I detest you. Andrew sat quietly, her words hurting. I'm sorry you feel this way. He replied gently, but I won't allow you suffer as a result of this. I've set up an account in your name sufficient to pay for your tuition and living expenses. I will always want the best for you, Julia. Did not Respo. Indeed, to her cries filling the room, Andrew stood and softly left his heart. He knew she was hurting, and though her wrath burned, he couldn't blame her. The evidence against Melissa, Victoria, and Harry was overwhelming, and they were convicted of conspiracy to commit. Melissa wept loudly when the conviction was read. She was condemned to hefty prison sentences for murder. Was read while Victoria kept her cold composure. Harry, defeated, hung his. Andrew won in silence, but it was a hollow victory. The life he had struggled to protect was gone, replaced by bitter memories and a damaged relationship with Julia. Consumed by wrath and anguish, broke off all communication and even denied the money he had laid up for her future. Andrew left the account undisturbed, hoping she would find it in her heart to forgive him one day. For the time being, he resolved to start afresh, gradually stepping away from her life, respecting her wants. If you love the narrative, keep the door open in case she decides to return. Please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a pleasant mood and luck.